It does not happen the way they expected. The loss, when it finally lands with its full weight, does not arrive as the clean, manageable event the avoidance system had been quietly preparing for since the beginning. The system that spent the entire relationship running contingency calculations, mapping exits, maintaining the psychological readiness to be alone, keeping one foot perpetually positioned toward the door, that system was prepared for many things. It was not prepared for this. Not for the specific quality of this particular absence. Not for the way the loss of someone who genuinely, completely, without agenda or performance or the complicated conditions that usually attach to love, loved them, does not feel like the relief that distance was supposed to feel like, does not settle into the comfortable self-sufficiency that was supposed to be waiting on the other side of the relationship's end, does not confirm the narrative that alone is simpler, that independence is preferable, that the management of closeness is more exhausting than the management of its absence. The system ran the calculation and got the wrong answer. And in the gap between the expected answer and the actual experience, something begins. Something the avoidant did not budget for, did not prepare for, did not have the appropriate internal infrastructure to receive. The beginning of genuine change. Not performed change. Not the change that is really just a new management strategy for the same underlying architecture. The actual, cellular, slow and often painful process by which a person whose entire relational life was organised around protection from exactly this kind of loss sits inside the loss and begins, for the first time, to examine the mechanism that produced it. This is what that examination looks like. What it costs, what it changes, and what emerges from the other side. The first thing that happens is not insight. Insight comes later. The first thing is disorientation. The avoidant was prepared for distance, had been, in some configuration, prepared for distance their entire life. The nervous system that was wired early to manage without support had developed, over decades, an extraordinary competence at the experience of being alone. Not just tolerating it, inhabiting it. Finding in solitude the specific resources that the architecture could not find in closeness. Thinking clearly, feeling more manageably, functioning at full capacity without the activation that proximity to genuine intimacy produced. Alone was something the avoidant knew how to do. But this aloneness is different, and the difference arrives before the avoidant has language for what distinguishes it. Previous aloneness had been chosen, or had felt chosen, had been the natural consequence of the distance the system consistently generated, which was experienced as preference rather than compulsion. The space after the relationship ends, when it ends because the person who was loving them fully, finally, completely stopped. This space was not chosen in the same way, was not the result of the avoidant moving toward what they wanted, was the result of something genuinely loved, departing from ground the avoidant did not defend. The aloneness tastes different, carries a different quality, has in it something that was not present in previous solitudes, the specific, unignorable flavour of loss, of something that was real and is now absent, and whose absence is not neutral. The system that was prepared for alone was not prepared for bereft, and bereft is what this is. In the early period, the weeks and sometimes months that follow the actual loss, the avoidance management strategies work overtime in a way that reveals their limitations more clearly than any previous operation of them. The deactivating narratives deploy with unusual speed and force. The relationship had problems. The person was not right for them. The connection, while real in some ways, was also complicated in ways that made it untenable. The distance the avoidant maintained was reasonable given the circumstances. The loss, however uncomfortable, is ultimately the correct outcome of a situation that was not sustainable. The strategies run, the narratives are constructed, and they work, partially, temporarily, with a quality of effortfulness that was not previously required. Because they keep failing in the same place, the specific, the concrete memories, the particular moments that the minimization narrative cannot adequately address because they are too real, too detailed, too personally imprinted in the nervous system to be successfully reframed as evidence of a relationship that was not right. The way this person laughed at the specific thing, the conversation that went somewhere neither of them had been before, the moment of genuine recognition, of being actually seen by someone who was looking clearly rather than projecting, that the avoidant had never experienced with equivalent precision, and that the deactivating story of "this was not right" cannot explain away. The specific memories are where the management fails, and failing specifically, failing against the concrete reality of what was real, is different from the ordinary cycling of avoidant pattern. It is the system encountering evidence that contradicts its core narrative at a level of precision the narrative cannot absorb. This is where the disorientation deepens into something more deliberate, more searching, something that begins, without quite announcing itself as inquiry, to ask questions the system was designed to prevent. The questions do not arrive cleanly. They do not come as organized, articulable inquiries that can be addressed in sequence. They arrive as a quality of unease, a persistent, low-frequency disturbance in the management has been constructing. A sense that the story being told about the relationship and its ending keeps developing holes that require patching, and the patching keeps requiring more of the narrative, and the narrative keeps getting more elaborate, and the elaboration keeps drawing attention to its own elaboration. The person who genuinely loved them. That phrase, however it arrives, in whatever form the avoidance interior presents it, is the load-bearing element that the management narrative was not built to support. Because the narrative that justifies the distance, the withdrawal, the pattern of behavior that ultimately produced the loss, that narrative requires the other person to have been in some way insufficient, too much, too needing, too something that justified the management, and they were not. The honesty that begins to emerge in this period, and it is not chosen honesty, it is the honesty that arrives when the management strategy has been running long enough, at high enough cost, that the system can no longer afford to maintain the fiction. This honesty keeps arriving at the same place. They loved me, actually loved me, without the conditions and the agendas and the complicated attachments that I was prepared for, without the eventual disappointment that I predicted, without the confirmation of everything the system believed about what closeness produces. They just loved me. And I managed that love like a threat. And now it is gone. The grief that follows this honesty is unlike the avoidant's previous experiences of emotional difficulty. Previous emotional difficulty was managed. The architecture was built for exactly that management, for the containment of feeling before it could reach full intensity, for the redirection of emotional content towards safer territory, for the maintenance of functional equilibrium regardless of what the interior was processing. This grief does not manage, not completely, not with the thoroughness that previous management achieved. It surfaces in the wrong moments, in the middle of the ordinary functioning that was supposed to be the reward of the self-sufficiency, in the middle of the work and the daily routine and the life that proceeds competently forward, it appears. Not always with dramatic force, sometimes with a quiet, persistent weight that is harder to dismiss than acute pain because it does not resolve, it simply continues. Present in the background of everything, the low, continuous frequency of someone who is discovering, in the experience of genuine loss, that the interior was more invested than the exterior ever indicated. The depth of the grief is proportional to the depth of what was suppressed throughout the relationship. The feeling that was managed, redirected, contained, it did not disappear, it was stored. And in the absence of the person it was stored in response to, it is surfacing now with the accumulated force of everything that was not allowed to surface in real time. The avoidant is meeting in the grief the actual magnitude of what they felt. often for the first time. Something shifts in the self-perception, not immediately, not with the clean, discrete quality of a realization that can be pointed to. Over time, with the grinding, reluctant, genuinely painful quality of a self-image being revised. The avoidant has understood themselves for most of their relational life through a particular lens: self-sufficient, autonomous, someone who values their independence, who does not need excessive closeness, who moves through relationships with the healthy detachment of a person who has not allowed themselves to be defined by any single connection. This self-understanding was partially accurate and partially a narrative that the management system required in order to function. The self-sufficiency was real. The autonomy was real. The capacity to function without external support was genuinely developed and genuinely valuable. What was narrative rather than reality was the not needing, the genuine absence of deep relational investment, the healthy detachment that was actually, underneath its self-understanding, defended withdrawal, the independence that was actually, beneath its genuine features, the managed performance of independence by someone who needed connection as much as anyone, but had developed the extraordinary capacity to prevent that need from being visible, even and especially to themselves. The grief is dismantling the narrative. Not the real features, those remain, are genuinely present, are part of who this person actually is. But the narrative layer. The story that said the management was health rather than protection. That said the distance was preference rather than compulsion. That said the pattern was reasonable rather than a mechanism that had just destroyed the most genuine love they had been offered. The story is being revised by the loss. And the revision is one of the most disorienting experiences available to someone whose entire interior architecture rested on the story's accuracy. In the disorientation, something begins that has no precedent in the avoidant's previous psychological history. Honest self-examination. Not the surface-level self-awareness that the avoidant often possesses in abundance, the intellectual understanding of patterns, the capacity to describe attachment dynamics with accuracy, the ability to observe and articulate what is happening from a considered distance. That kind of self-awareness was always available. It was, in fact, one of the ways the system managed, by understanding the pattern well enough to discuss it without having to feel it. This is different. This is examination that includes feeling. That does not allow the intellectual framing to create the protective distance that has previously allowed the examination to occur without the examined material actually being encountered. The avoidant looks at what happened, at the specific behavioural sequence, at the moments of withdrawal and the moments of return, and the patterns of distance, and the mechanisms of the pushing away, and the particular way the person who loved them was, over and over, given not quite enough of what they needed. And the examination does not produce the usual, comfortable, self-justifying conclusions. It produces recognition of what was done, of what the doing cost the person it was done to, of the specific, human, genuinely caring person who was loved imperfectly and from behind walls and in the specifically insufficient way that avoidant love expresses when it has not been examined, and who eventually, exhausted and depleted, and having given more than they had available to give, stopped. The recognition of what their behaviour produced in another person, a person they loved, a person who did not deserve the pattern, is one of the most uncomfortable experiences in the spectrum of human self-awareness. It is also one of the most necessary. The examination of the pattern leads somewhere, not quickly, and not without considerable resistance, but with the specific persistence of something that cannot be fully suppressed once it has been started. It leads to the question of origin. Where did this come from? not as an intellectual exercise. The avoidant may have known the intellectual answer for years, may have been able to articulate attachment theory, early relational experience, the adaptive mechanisms of childhood environments that required self-sufficiency. The intellectual knowing was always available. It was part of the sophisticated self-understanding that coexisted comfortably with the unchanged pattern. What is being asked now is different. Not where did this come from, as a category of psychological phenomenon, but where did this come from in me, in the specific interior of this specific person, in the particular early experiences that wrote the specific version of this pattern, that just cost them the loss of someone who genuinely loved them. This more personal, more embodied, more genuinely felt version of the question produces different engagement with the material. The early experiences that are being examined are not being examined as clinical data. They are being felt, many of them perhaps for the first time, with the adult emotional capacity that was not available when the experiences occurred. The child who learned to stop reaching because reaching was not met. The child who developed self-sufficiency as survival rather than preference. The child who encoded, at the level of the nervous system, the association between need and disappointment, between closeness and loss, between loving and being hurt by the loving. Meeting that child, not as a theoretical construct, but as the actual formative experience now being genuinely contacted, is the beginning of the most significant change available to an avoidant. It is the beginning of understanding the pattern, not just as behaviour to be managed, but as a wound to be grieved. The grieving of the wound is different from the grieving of the loss. The loss is the specific, present tense, acutely felt absence of the person who loved them. The wound is older, preceded this person by decades, is the original source of the architecture that produced the pattern that created the loss. Grieving the wound means sitting with the original hurt, the early experiences of reaching and not being met, the specific disappointments that trained the system, the developmental moments where the environment communicated, through its response to the child's natural need for closeness and comfort and attunement, that those needs were not reliably safe to have. This grief is the one the architecture was built to prevent. The containment system, at its root, was built to prevent exactly this contact with exactly this material. The elaborate structure of self-sufficiency and managed distance and emotional containment was, at its deepest level, the prevention of this feeling. The loss cracked the architecture sufficiently for the feeling to surface. And the feeling, once it surfaces, once the original wound is actually felt rather than managed, produces something that the sophisticated intellectual self-awareness never produced. Compassion. For the child who built the architecture. For the necessity of the building. For the genuine adaptiveness of the protection given the environment in which it was constructed. And alongside the compassion for the child, something else. Something that emerges from the compassion and extends beyond it. The recognition that the child's solution is no longer the adult's only option. This recognition that the architecture was appropriate then and is costing everything now is the pivot point. The specific juncture at which the change that has been accumulating becomes directional rather than simply painful. Before this point, the avoidant is processing loss and discovering wound and grieving and disorienting. All of that is necessary. None of it is yet change in the active sense. It is the preparation for change, the clearing of the ground. The recognition creates the possibility of building something different on the cleared ground, not immediately, not without the significant ongoing work that genuine change at this depth requires, not without the professional support that the depth of early wiring often necessitates for the revision to reach the places where the wiring lives. But possible. Actually, genuinely, for the first time felt as possible rather than theoretically acknowledged as possible. The avoidant who could describe their attachment patterns accurately for years without the description producing any movement begins, in this recognition, to experience the gap between describing and changing as something crossable rather than fixed. That experience, the felt possibility of genuine change rather than its intellectual acknowledgement, is one of the most significant shifts available to a human being. What does the change actually look like? In behaviour, in how the avoidant moves through subsequent relationships, in what is different in the practical, daily, relational reality of someone who has done this work. It looks like tolerance for discomfort that previously triggered automatic exit. The intimacy that arrives in a new connection, the warmth, the closeness, the genuine relational weight of two people moving toward each other produces the familiar activation. The nervous system has not been replaced. The wiring that learned to read closeness as threat does not simply uninstall. The activation occurs. The pull toward distance is felt. What is different is what happens next. Previously, the activation was managed automatically. The distance was created without the system submitting the response for any kind of review. The withdrawal happened, and the narrative followed, and the pattern completed itself without interruption. Now there is a pause, not always, not perfectly, not without the pattern still sometimes completing itself in the old way before the pause can intervene. But with increasing frequency, in the space between the activation and the automatic response, something is inserted. The question: is this actually dangerous? Or does it feel dangerous because of what I learned a long time ago? That question, which requires the self-awareness not just as intellectual knowing, but as genuine felt capacity to distinguish present reality from historical encoding, changes the output, not always to the ideal response, but to something more considered, more chosen, more the actual person responding to actual circumstances, rather than the historical wound responding to the present moment as though it were the past. The avoidant who has done this work relates to vulnerability differently, not comfortably, not without the residual activation that decades of wiring produce in the face of genuine exposure, but differently, with the specific difference of someone who has learned, through the hard experience of genuine loss and genuine grief and genuine examination, that the vulnerability they were protected against is survivable. The armour does not fall, but it becomes, in specific moments with specific people, something that can be set down deliberately, rather than only removed by force. The choice to be vulnerable, partial, imperfect, still somewhat contained, but genuinely intentional, becomes available in a way it was not available before. This is not nothing. For someone whose architecture was designed to prevent exactly this kind of choice from being possible, the availability of the choice is an extraordinary development, not the completion of healing, the beginning of the capacity for genuine intimacy that was always the goal of the architecture's opposite, the self-protective distance that ended up protecting against the very thing it was always, at its root, longing for. They think about you differently now, the person who loved them, the specific one whose loving was the catalyst for all of this, not with the complicated, management-requiring emotional activation of someone still in the middle of attachment, with something more settled, more honest, more capable of holding the full picture, the genuine love that was there, the genuine insufficiency of what they offered in return, the real loss that was produced, the real cost that was paid by someone who deserved better, without the defensive distortion that previously would have simplified the picture in whichever direction served the management. There is gratitude. Not the simple, uncomplicated gratitude of someone for whom the relationship ended well. The more complex, more hard-won gratitude of someone who understands that the loss, as genuinely painful as it was also the specific event that cracked the architecture enough for the light to enter. That loving this specific person and losing this specific person through the mechanism of their own pattern was the experience that made the examination possible, that made the grief necessary, that made the change, actual, genuine, not just described change, begin. You were not just loved by them, you changed them. In the permanent, architectural, having reached the actual wiring way that the deepest changes occur. Not because you tried to, not because you stayed long enough, or gave enough, or were patient enough, or said the right things, because you loved honestly. And the honesty of your loving, meeting the architecture of their defense, produced eventually, painfully, through the specific mechanism of loss, the collision that was necessary. The collision that genuinely loved people sometimes produce in the people who could not yet receive them. And in that collision, in the grief that followed, in the examination that the grief made unavoidable, something real began, in someone who thought they were beyond beginning.